class, welcome to the next segment in lecture 19. And in this segment, we're going to talk a little bit about warm fronts. So basically the same topic that we did in the previous segment with cold fronts, but now we're going to focus on warm fronts. So again, just to refresh your memory on the symbology here. So typically for a warm front, that's denoted by a nice red line with semicircles pointing in the direction that the front is moving. And again, for a surface front, those semicircles or those symbols are filled in, and for an upper air boundary, those symbols are left open, they're not filled in. So again, same idea as a cold front, except instead of triangles, we use semicircles to represent a warm front, and we use a red line to represent a warm front, whereas a cold front, it's a blue line. And in comparison to cold fronts, warm fronts are typically slow moving. So you may remember back in the lecture on cyclones, I mentioned that it's much harder for the warm air to move north than it is for the cold air to move south. And that's just due to the fact that cold air is much more dense than warm air. And as a physical consequence, this means that warm fronts move a lot more slowly than cold fronts do, typically speaking. On rare occasions, you can get warm fronts that move very quickly, but usually that's not the case. Usually warm fronts are very slow moving in comparison to cold fronts. And a lot of times the warm fronts will move from south to north, or to some extent they may also move from southwest to northeast. Sometimes this is the case if you have a very intense cyclone, but typically warm fronts move to some extent from south to north or from southwest to northeast. And unlike cold fronts, which have a very steep slope, when you look at the vertical cross-section of the interface between warm air and cold air, warm fronts have a very shallow slope. And this means that you're going to have relatively weak upward motions or vertical motions in comparison to, say, a cold front, which has very strong upward motions. And while warm fronts usually don't trigger a lot of severe weather events on their own, these are very important in a lot of severe weather events because the warm front basically marks where the atmosphere is unstable and where the atmosphere is not as stable. If you've got a region in the atmosphere that is very unstable, again, where you can have surface-based convection. So you may remember back to, again, the previous lecture where we talked about the warm sector where you can have surface-based thunderstorms. Warm fronts, as they move north, they create a larger area where you can have surface-based thunderstorms. And again, those surface-based thunderstorms are what you want if you want to, say, get a tornado outbreak or a high-end severe weather event of some kind. Another interesting thing about warm fronts is these actually can be somewhat unpredictable. In fact, there are a lot of severe weather forecasts that sometimes go wrong because the warm front did something unexpected. Either it didn't move as far north as expected or it moved farther north than what was previously expected. I remember one particular event that affected the Dallas-Fort Worth area. It was April 2011. It was the day before the super outbreak that occurred in the southeast. There was a warm front that was moving very rapidly north at first, and then a bunch of thunderstorms formed right along the southern fringe of the warm front and actually just caused it to stall. So the warm front was originally expecting to make it all the way to DFW, which it had. You probably would have had a tornado outbreak in the DFW area, but it ended up stalling south of the Metroplex, which is a good thing for the Metroplex, but not so good for the people who were caught where you had multiple tornadic storms tracking along the warm front. And then eventually that warm front over Arkansas ended up moving north, and then you had a tornado and wind event that occurred in Arkansas. But just a bit of a background on warm fronts. These can be very difficult to predict. It's really hard to know where these are actually going to set up in the atmosphere, even if you're using some sort of advanced computer model. A lot of times the models don't actually get it right where the warm front is. And in comparison to cold fronts, which typically have very sharp temperature gradients or thermal gradients, warm fronts tend to have very broad thermal gradients. But again, there are exceptions to this rule as well. May 20, 2019, which had a very unusually intense warm front and cyclone. If you looked at the temperature map, if you looked at where the warm front is, it actually looked like a cold front because the temperature gradient was that intense. It was really something to see, especially if you looked at the Oklahoma mesonet, which showed this really well. If you just looked at the temperature gradient, not the wind field, you would have thought that was an Arctic cold front or something, just by how intense the thermal gradient was. But warm fronts generally, though, have very broad, relatively weak temperature gradients. So again, just a diagram illustrating what was brought up in the second point here. Unlike a cold front, which has a very steep slope resulting in strong upward motions, warm front, you have a very shallow slope in the cold air, which results in relatively weak upward motions. And this is one of the reasons why you usually don't get especially strong thunderstorms forming along a northward progressing warm front because the upward motions are so weak. But again, there are exceptions to this. If the atmosphere is especially unstable, then even a weak upward motion can translate into a really intense thunderstorm. But that's going to do it on this segment for warm fronts. And in the next segment, we're going to talk about two fronts at the same time, not because they're related, but because I don't have a whole lot to say about them, quite frankly. But we will talk about stationary fronts and occluded fronts in the next segment. So with that, I will see you all there.